She clutched her baby brother as he was being sold at Silver Creek's human auction. His tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb while strangers bid on their broken lives until a feared Apache chief emerged from the desert shadows and changed everything. The Arizona Territory's sun blazed merciless and vindictive over Silver Creek on that August morning of 1876, turning the town's wooden buildings into furnaces and the packed dirt streets into rivers of choking dust. Heat rose in shimmering waves from every surface, distorting the world like a fever dream that refused to break. The courthouse steps had been transformed into something unholy, a crude wooden platform where human dignity went to die, where families were torn apart by the highest bidder's greed. 17-year-old Lucia Morales stood on those weathered planks, her bare feet burning against the wood, her arms wrapped protectively around 8-month-old Miguel, whose dark eyes stared up at her with the innocent trust that only babies possess.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Crowd gathered like vultures circling carrion, their faces twisted with a mixture of curiosity, disgust, and cold calculation. They weren't seeing a young woman desperately trying to protect her baby brother. They were seeing property, labor, profit margins written in flesh and blood. Sheriff Cornelius Wade stood beside the platform, his badge glinting like a star of false authority, reading from a document that sealed their fate with legal precision. His voice carried over the murmuring crowd with the practiced tone of a man who'd sold too many lives to feel shame anymore. Lucia Morales, age 17, charged with theft of livestock and destruction of property. Wade announced, his words cutting through the oppressive heat like a blade. The defendant stands accused of stealing 3 horses from the Blackwood Ranch and burning down their grain storage facility, resulting in damages totaling $247. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, each word another nail in the coffin of her freedom. Baby Miguel Morales, 8 months, to be sold separately as per territorial law regarding criminal offspring. The crowd's murmur grew louder, more eager, as if the promise of separating a child from his sister was entertainment rather than cruelty. The truth was buried beneath layers of lies and manufactured evidence, as inconvenient truths often were. In frontier towns where justice bent to the will of those with gold in their pockets, Lucia had indeed taken the horses, but not for theft. 3 weeks earlier, when the fever had taken their parents within days of each other, Lucia found herself alone with a crying baby and no means of survival. The Blackwood Ranch, owned by the ruthless cattle baron Edmund Blackwood, had employed her father as a stable hand for 5 years until a leg injury made him useless dead weight, as Blackwood so eloquently put it. When her parents fell ill, Blackwood refused to provide medicine or even allow the town doctor onto his property, claiming that Mexican workers were expendable and not worth the expense of medical care, the same attitude that now saw their children standing on an auction block. The horses she'd taken were payment for 5 years of her father's loyal service, wages that Blackwood had refused to pay during her father's final illness. The grain facility had burned because she'd accidentally knocked over a lantern while searching for food to keep Miguel alive, not from any malicious intent. But truth was a luxury that poor Mexican orphans couldn't afford in Silver Creek, where justice was measured in dollars and skin color determined guilt. Edmund Blackwood's word carried more weight than any evidence, his influence reaching into every corner of the territorial government, like poison seeping into groundwater. Now then, Sheriff Wade continued, his voice cutting through her memories. Like a rusty knife, we'll start the bidding for the girl at $50. She's young, strong, good for household work or field labor. Bidders should note that criminal history makes her suitable for hard labor rather than domestic service. His words stripped away her humanity piece by piece, reducing 17 years of life, love, and loss to a simple commodity assessment. She was livestock being evaluated for her working capacity, her ability to generate profit for whoever purchased her broken spirit. A voice from the crowd called out, rough and eager. What about breeding potential? Girls young enough to produce workers for years. Lucia's stomach churned as laughter rippled through the assembled men, their eyes crawling over her body like insects. She pulled Miguel closer to her chest, feeling his tiny heartbeat against her ribs, the only pure thing left in a world gone mad with greed and cruelty. Even holding her brother felt like a rebellion against their attempts to dehumanize her. A small act of defiance in the face of overwhelming evil. Bidding will address that matter with the purchaser. Wade replied with bureaucratic coldness, as if discussing the breeding habits of cattle rather than a teenage girl's future. Current territorial law allows purchasers full discretion in the employment of indentured servants. The euphemism fooled no one. They all knew what full discretion meant in practice, what happened to young women sold into frontier servitude. The law was just pretty words painted over an ugly reality, legal language designed to make slavery palatable to Christian consciences. The first bid came from a voice she recognized with sick dread. $60 for the girl. Marcus Brennan, owner of the copper mine outside town, stepped forward with a grin that revealed tobacco-stained teeth. Brennan was known for working his indentured laborers to death in the mine shafts, treating human beings like picks and shovels, to be used until they broke. His offer meant a slow death in darkness and dust, her lungs filling with copper particles until she couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't remember what sunlight looked like. 75. Countered another voice, this one belonging to Silas Crenshaw, who ran a bordello disguised as a boarding house on the outskirts of town. Crenshaw's establishments were where young women disappeared into lives of degradation and despair, their spirits crushed as thoroughly as their bodies. His bid promised a different kind of death, slower but just as certain. A gradual erosion of everything that made her human until only an empty shell remained. Lucia closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of men haggling over her flesh. Like merchants at a livestock auction. Miguel began to fuss, his small fists waving in the air as he sensed her, distressed through some mysterious bond that connected them despite his tender age. She hummed softly to him, a lullaby their mother had sung during those final fever-racked nights, when death stalked their small adobe house like a patient hunter. The melody was all she had left of home, the last thread connecting her to a time when love existed in their world. $100. The bid came from a new voice, smooth and educated, cutting through the rough frontier accents like silk through burlap. Dr. Harrison Webb stepped forward, his black medical bag in hand, his expression professionally neutral. Webb was known as a decent man, a healer who served both white and Mexican families without discrimination. But Lucia had heard whispers about his special interests in human anatomy. Even mercy could hide darker purposes, and she'd learned that kindness often came with prices too terrible to pay. The bidding war intensified as more voices joined the fray, each offer higher than the last, each representing a different flavor of hell awaiting her. The crowd's energy grew more frenzied with each bid, feeding off the spectacle of human misery like predators drawn to blood. They weren't just buying a person, they were participating in a ritual of domination, a ceremony that reinforced their own sense of power over the powerless. Every dollar bid was another brick in the wall that separated the worthy from the worthless. 150. Called out a woman's shrill voice from near the back of the crowd. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, wife of the territorial judge, pushed her way forward with the imperious confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. Ashford was known for her charity work with orphan children, though the children who entered her household were rarely seen in town afterward. Her smile was all Christian piety and hidden cruelty, the kind of benevolence that left scars on the soul. The afternoon sun climbed higher, turning the platform into a griddle that burned through the thin solace of Lucia's worn shoes. Sweat dripped steadily from her forehead, stinging her eyes and making it hard to see clearly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Miguel whimpered in the heat, his small body growing limp against her chest as dehydration began to take its toll. She tried to shield him with her body, creating what little shade she could, but there was nowhere to hide from the merciless Arizona sun or the equally merciless crowd below. Now for the baby, Sheriff Wade announced once the bidding for Lucia had reached its peak at $175, sold to Dr. Webb with his mysterious medical interests. 8 months old, healthy Mexican stock, good for raising as household help or field worker. Starting bid at $20. The casual way he described Miguel, as if her baby brother were a calf or a piglet, sent rage blazing through Lucia's chest like wildfire. She would die before letting them take him, would fight with her bare hands against the entire crowd if necessary. 25. Called out Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the banker's wife, stepping forward with calculating eyes that appraised Miguel like a piece of furniture. Whitmore was known for adopting orphan children as unpaid servants, working them like slaves while maintaining the pretense of Christian charity. Her household was a place where childhood went to die, where small hands learned to scrub floors before they learned to write their own names. Lucia's grip on Miguel tightened until her knuckles turned white, her arms becoming a protective cage around the only family she had left in the world. The baby looked up at her with those trusting dark eyes, completely unaware that strangers were deciding his fate, that his sister might not be able to protect him much longer. She had promised their dying mother that she would keep Miguel safe, that she would be both sister and guardian to him. It was a promise that seemed impossible to keep as the bids climbed higher and her own sale to Dr. Webb became final $30. Another voice, this one belonging to Frank Morrison, who owned a cattle ranch 50 miles south of town. Morrison was known for his cruelty to both animals and workers, a man who believed that pain was the only effective teacher. Miguel would grow up under the lash if Morrison claimed him, would learn to fear the sound of approaching footsteps and the crack of leather against flesh. The heat pressed down on them like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. The crowd's voices seemed to merge into a single roar of greed and malice, a sound like rushing water that threatened to carry them both away into an ocean of suffering. Lucia felt herself drowning in their hatred and indifference, suffocating on the toxic atmosphere of a place where human beings were reduced to market commodities. $40 for the baby. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose above the others, sharp with determination and barely concealed avarice. She wanted to add another small slave to her collection of charity cases, another life to grind down under the weight of false piety. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth, the predatory grin of someone who'd learned to feast on the misery of children. Lucia opened her mouth to scream, to protest, to beg them not to separate her from the only family she had left in the world. But before any sound could escape her throat, a different kind of silence fell over the crowd, not the eager quiet of anticipation, but the heavy stillness that comes when death walks among the living. Something had changed, shifted, like the moment before lightning strikes when the very air seems to hold its breath. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees that lined Silver Creek's main street. Then came the sound that would haunt the nightmares of every person present for years to come, the rhythmic thunder of unshod hooves against hard-packed earth, growing louder with each passing second. Riders were coming, and they weren't the kind of visitors that Silver Creek's respectable citizens wanted to see. From the heat shimmer at the far end of the street, shapes began to emerge like figures stepping out of a mirage. Horses and riders, moving with the fluid grace of predators who owned the desert, who had never bowed to the white man's law or accepted his claims of dominion over ancient lands. The lead rider sat tall and straight on a paint stallion that moved like liquid shadow, his long black hair flowing behind him like a war banner. Even at distance, power radiated from him like heat from a forge, an aura of controlled violence that made the air itself seem to tremble as they drew closer. Details became clear that sent whispers of recognition and fear rippling through the crowd like ripples on a pond disturbed by falling stones. Apache warriors, painted for war, carrying rifles and traditional weapons with equal comfort and deadly familiarity. But it was their leader who commanded every eye, every terrified breath, every rapidly beating heart in the suddenly silent square. Ayana Nalnish, the eternal warrior, whose name was spoken in whispers around frontier campfires, whose exploits had become legend even among his enemies. He was a chief whose raids had humbled the U.S. cavalry, and whose tactical brilliance had earned him grudging respect even from those who hunted him. He stood 6 feet tall in the saddle, his chest adorned with traditional Apache war paint and silver ornaments that caught the sunlight like captured stars. His face was a masterwork of controlled fury, high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. The crowd began to back away from the platform, their earlier bloodlust replaced by the primal fear that came from facing an apex predator on his home territory. Silver Creek might pretend to be civilized, might wave its flags and quote its laws, but everyone knew they were trespassers in Apache land, tolerated only as long as they didn't push too far. Today, apparently they had pushed far enough to wake the sleeping dragon that lived in the desert mountains. Sheriff Wade's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped as he realized the futility of the gesture. 20 Apache warriors faced a crowd of perhaps 60 townspeople, but the odds felt reversed when facing men who had been born to war, who moved and fought as one seamless unit forged in the crucible of survival. Wade's authority, his badge, his legal documents, all of it meant nothing in the face of such primal, undiluted power. Ayana guided his stallion forward until he was close enough to the platform that Lucia could see the intricate beadwork on his war shirt, could smell the sage and leather scent that clung to him like an aura of the wild places. His eyes met hers across the space between them, and she felt something pass between them that had nothing to do with words or language. Recognition, perhaps, or shared understanding of what it meant to be hunted, to be considered less than human. By those who held power. When Ayana finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of mountains and storms, accented English that had been learned from captured soldiers and missionary teachers, but delivered with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to speak. The auction ends now. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and terror that spread through the crowd like a plague of sudden understanding. Sheriff Wade found his voice, though it cracked with barely controlled terror and the desperate bravado of a small man trying to seem large. Now see here, Chief, this is a legal proceeding under territorial law. You got no jurisdiction here. His words sounded hollow even to his own ears, empty posturing in the face of a power that predated any law the white man had ever written. Legal documents were just paper when facing steel and fury, and the righteous anger of those who had been wronged too many times. Ayana's laugh was like thunder rolling across distant peaks, rich with dark amusement at the sheriff's presumption and the pathetic nature of his protest. Your law, he said, dismounting from his stallion with fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle, exists only where you are strong enough to enforce it. Here, today, you are not strong enough. His warriors spread out behind him in perfect formation, creating a semicircle that encompassed the entire platform and cutting off any avenue of escape. The crowd pressed back further, some people beginning to slip away entirely rather than risk being caught in whatever was about to unfold. Those who remained did so out of morbid curiosity or simple paralysis, unable to move in the face of such overwhelming presence. They had come to see others suffer and now found themselves potential victims of forces beyond their comprehension or control. Dr. Webb stepped forward, his medical training perhaps giving him courage that others lacked, or perhaps simple human decency finally overriding his self-preservation instincts. "Chief Nalnish," he said carefully, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "these proceedings are sanctioned by the territorial government. The girl and baby are convicted criminals being sold to pay their debts to society." His words were reasonable, logical, the kind of explanation that might work in a courtroom where men in robes pretended that justice was blind. But they were standing in the desert, where different laws applied and older powers held sway. Yana turned his attention to Webb, studying him with the intensity of a hawk evaluating prey, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the doctor's appearance and demeanor. "Debts," he repeated, tasting the word like something bitter that had been forced down his throat. "A child of 8 months has debts to your society? A girl who took horses to feed her starving brother is a criminal worthy of slavery?" His voice rose with each word, carrying the accumulated fury of his people's centuries of suffering. Every broken treaty, every murdered family, every stolen child echoed in his tone like thunder rolling across endless canyons. "The law," Webb began, but Ayana cut him off with a gesture that was both elegant and absolutely final, his hand slicing through the air like a blade that severed all pretense of civilized discourse. "I know your law," Ayana said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the square, penetrating the souls of every person present like an arrow finding its mark. "I have seen it written in the blood of my people, carved into the bones of our children, signed with the tears of our women. Your law is the law of the strong taking from the weak, dressed in pretty words to make the taking seem righteous." He stepped closer to the platform, close enough that Lucia could see the silver bracelet around his wrist, inscribed with symbols that spoke of honor and protection. Close enough to offer hope where none had existed before. Miguel chose that moment to let out a small cry, his baby voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Lucia rocked him gently, whispering words of comfort in Spanish, and Ayana's eyes fixed on the tender scene with something that might have been recognition. Perhaps he too had once protected someone smaller and weaker than himself, had felt the crushing weight of responsibility for an innocent life in a world that showed no mercy to the defenseless. When Ayana spoke again, his voice carried a finality that made the desert wind itself seem to pause and listen, as if even the elements recognized the gravity of what was about to unfold. "The girl and baby come with me. Anyone who objects may challenge that decision with steel rather than words." His hand rested casually on the handle of a knife that looked like it had tasted blood recently, the worn leather grip molded by countless battles. The offer was genuine, and everyone present knew it. Sheriff Wade's face had gone pale as bleached bone, but his position demanded that he maintain some semblance of authority, even in the face of certain death. "You can't just take them, Chief. There are legal procedures, territorial jurisdiction, federal oversight." His voice grew higher and more desperate with each word, like a man trying to convince himself that the cliff beneath his feet wasn't crumbling away. "Federal oversight," Ayana repeated with a laugh that held no humor, only the bitter knowledge of betrayals too numerous to count. "Like the federal oversight that promised my people safety on the reservation while soldiers slaughtered our children. Like the federal oversight that guaranteed us food and medicine while bureaucrats sold our supplies to white settlers for profit." His warriors shifted behind him, hands moving unconsciously to weapons, their faces hard as granite carved by desert winds. Marcus Brennan, perhaps emboldened by liquid courage or simple stupidity, stepped forward with his chest puffed out like a rooster challenging a wolf. "Now hold on there, Chief. I paid good money for that girl, and I intend to collect what's mine. You got no right to interfere with legal commerce." His words hung in the air like the smell of sulfur before an explosion, and several people in the crowd took involuntary steps backward. Ayana's response was swift and terrifying in its precision. In one fluid motion, He drew his knife and sent it spinning through the air, the blade embedding itself in the wooden post inches from Brennan's head. The mine owner's face went white as fresh snow, and a dark stain spread across the front of his trousers as his body betrayed his fear. "I have every right," Ayanna said quietly, "to protect the innocent from wolves who wear the masks of civilized men." The demonstration had its intended effect. The crowd's murmur died completely, replaced by the kind of silence that precedes avalanches or earthquakes. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, stamping nervously and rolling their eyes as primitive instincts warned them of approaching violence. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, the judge's wife who had bid so eagerly for Lucia, found her voice despite the terror that gripped her throat like cold fingers. "This is madness. You can't simply ride into a civilized town and steal property that has been legally purchased. My husband will have the entire territorial militia hunting you down like the savage you are." Her words carried the full weight of her social position, the absolute confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Your husband," he said, his voice carrying a note of amusement that somehow made it more frightening than his anger, "is welcome to try. Tell him to bring his militia, his cavalry, his cannons, and his fine uniforms. Tell him to bring whatever federal oversight he can muster." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "Then tell him to dig many graves because not all of his men will be going home." Dr. Webb, perhaps sensing that violence was only moments away, tried one more time to find a peaceful resolution. "Chief Nullnish, surely we can reach some accommodation. Perhaps a monetary settlement, or an exchange of goods." But his words died in his throat as Ayanna's gaze fell upon him with the weight of mountains. "You wish to purchase their freedom with gold?" Ayanna asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity mixed with contempt. "How much is a child's innocence worth in your market? How many silver pieces for a sister's love? Name your price, doctor, and let us see if your civilization can afford the cost of its own hypocrisy." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dr. Webb opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing that there was no answer that wouldn't damn him in the eyes of both man and God. The auction had reduced human beings to commodities, and now he was being forced to confront the true moral cost of his participation. Sheriff Wade, seeing his authority crumbling like sand before the tide, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "You're making a mistake, Chief. Take them if you must, but know that this act of theft will bring consequences down on your entire tribe. The territorial governor will demand justice, and justice will come with soldiers and bullets. Justice." Ayanna repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a prayer spoken in a dead language. "Your people speak often of justice, yet I have never seen them practice it. Where was justice when the cavalry burned our villages? Where was justice when settlers poisoned our water sources? Where was justice when your government promised us peace and gave us war?" His voice grew stronger with each question, carrying the accumulated pain of his people like a burden too heavy for any one man to bear. But then his expression softened slightly as his gaze returned to Lucia and Miguel on the platform. The young woman stood frozen between terror and hope, clutching her baby brother as if he were the last piece of solid ground in a world that had gone mad. Her dark eyes met his across the space between them, and something passed between them that transcended language, culture, and the artificial barriers that men erected to justify their cruelties. "You," Ayanna said, addressing Lucia directly. For the first time, his voice gentle in a way that seemed impossible given the violence that crackled around him like electricity before a storm. "What is your name, little sister?" The endearment came naturally, as if she had already been adopted into the family of his protection. Lucia's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, cracked from thirst and fear, but still carrying the melody of her heritage. "Lucia Morales." Center. And this is Miguel, my brother." She lifted the baby slightly, as if presenting him to a king rather than a war chief whose very presence had turned the town's power structure upside down. Ayanna nodded gravely, as if she had just shared something sacred rather than simply stating their names. "Lucia Morales," he repeated, giving each syllable the weight it deserved. "Your brother is blessed to have such a fierce protector. But today, you both need protection from those who would separate you for profit." He gestured toward his warriors, who had remained silent but alert throughout the confrontation, like wolves waiting for their pack leader's signal. "My warriors and I were passing through your territory when we heard the sound of this ... Auction," Ayanna continued, his voice carrying across the square like a judgment pronounced from on high. "We came to see what manner of goods were being sold that required such a large gathering. Imagine our surprise to discover that you're Christian. Civilization was trafficking in children and orphans." The last words dripped with sarcasm so pure it could have etched glass. Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife who had bid on Miguel, stepped forward with the desperate courage of someone who saw her prize slipping away. "Now see here, those children are legally bound to serve as indentured servants until their debts are paid. It's not slavery, it's a recognized form of labor contract sanctioned by territorial law." Her voice rose to a shrill pitch as she tried to justify the unjustifiable. Ayanna's laugh was like the sound of wind through canyon walls, hollow and echoing with ancient sorrows. "Indentured servants," he said, as if tasting something foul. "Such pretty words you use to dress up your cruelties. Tell me, banker's wife, what debts can an 8-month-old baby possibly owe to your society? What crimes has he committed that justify his enslavement?" His questions came like arrows, each one finding its mark in the soft flesh of her moral pretensions. The woman's face flushed red as sunset over the desert, but she pressed on with the stubborn determination of someone who had never been forced to examine the foundations of her beliefs. "The baby is an accessory to his sister's crimes. The territorial code clearly states that." But her words were cut off by Ayanna's raised hand, a gesture so commanding that it silenced her as effectively as a physical blow. "Enough," he said simply. And the single word carried more authority than all of Sheriff Wade's legal documents combined. "I have heard enough of your laws, your codes, your justifications for evil. A people who would sell children in the name of justice have forfeited the right to call themselves civilized." He turned to address the entire crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the square like thunder rolling across the desert. "Let this be clearly understood. These children are under my protection now. Any who would harm them answer to me and mine." The threat was unmistakable, and its implications sent ripples of fear through the assembled townspeople like stones dropped into still water. Ayanna Nalmish was not making an idle boast. He was stating a fact as immutable as the rising of the sun. Cross him and face the consequences that would surely follow. Dr. Webb, who had purchased Lucia only minutes before, stepped forward one more time, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Chief, I paid good money for the girl. Surely you understand the concept of property rights, even if you reject our legal system. That money came from my medical practice, from healing the sick and helping the wounded. I'm not some slave driver or mine owner, I'm a doctor trying to help people." His voice carried genuine distress, as if he truly believed his intentions might matter in the face of what was unfolding. Ayanna studied the doctor for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to peer into the man's soul and weigh what he found. "There, you heal bodies, doctor, but you were willing to purchase a soul. You save lives with one hand while buying human flesh with the other. Which of these actions defines you? Which will you choose when they cannot coexist?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, forcing Webb to confront the contradictions in his own nature. The doctor's face went pale as he realized the trap his good intentions had led him into. He had told himself he was rescuing Lucia from worse fates, that his purchase was an act of mercy rather than participation in an evil system. But Ayana's words stripped away those comfortable self-deceptions, revealing the ugly truth beneath. I wanted to help her, Webb stammered, his professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. I thought ... I believed I could provide her with decent treatment, maybe even eventual freedom. I'm not like the others. I swear it on my oath as a physician. His words carried the desperate sincerity of a man watching his self-image crumble before his eyes. Ayana's expression softened slightly, as if recognizing the doctor's genuine internal struggle. Perhaps you speak truth, medicine man. Perhaps. Your heart held good intentions even as your hands performed evil actions. But the road to destruction is paved with such intentions, and the girl would still be your property regardless of how kindly you treated her. He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering his final judgment. Good intentions cannot wash the stain of slavery from your soul. The crowd had grown restless during this exchange, some people beginning to edge toward the sides of the square in search of escape routes. The presence of Ayana and his warriors had transformed what should have been a routine legal proceeding into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Women clutched their children closer, men fingered weapons they knew would be useless, and everyone tried to avoid direct eye contact with the Apache warriors who watched them with the patient intensity of predators. Sheriff Wade, perhaps sensing that his last chance to maintain any semblance of control was slipping away, decided to make one final stand. Chief Nalnish, I respect your reputation and your people's right to travel through this territory. But you're asking me to violate my oath of office, to ignore the legal proceedings that are my responsibility to oversee. If I let you take these criminals, I'll answer to the territorial governor, the federal marshals, maybe even the president himself. His voice carried the weight of a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Ayana's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. Then answer to them, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Explain to your governor how you allowed children to be sold like cattle in the name of Christian justice. Tell your federal marshals how you stood by while innocents were condemned to slavery for the crime of trying to survive. Write your report to the president about how the great American experiment requires the bondage of orphan babies to function properly. Each word hit like a physical blow, stripping away the last vestiges of moral authority from the proceedings. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Every person present understood that they had reached a moment of absolute truth, where all pretense and justification had been burned away to reveal the naked reality beneath. They were faced with a choice: continue participating in an evil system, or acknowledge the horror of what they had been doing. Miguel began to cry again, his small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Lucia rocked him gently, whispering soft words in Spanish, and the sound of her lullaby seemed to highlight the absurdity of the entire situation. Here was an infant whose only crime was being born to the wrong parents in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet the territorial law demanded his enslavement as payment for debts he could never have incurred. Ayana watched this tender scene with eyes that had seen too much suffering, too much injustice, too many families torn apart by the greed and indifference of those who claimed moral superiority. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of personal experience and ancient wisdom. I have children of my own, little sister, he said to Lucia, his words gentle as a summer breeze. I have held my babies in the dark hours before dawn, felt their small hearts beating against my chest, known the fierce love that makes a parent willing to die rather than see their child harmed. That love recognizes no boundaries of race or nation. It is the one pure thing in a world full of corruption. His words seemed to cast a spell over the gathered crowd, reminding them of their own children, their own moments of tender vulnerability, their own desperate need to protect what they loved most. For just an instant, the artificial barriers that divided them seemed to dissolve, revealing the common humanity that connected all parents regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. But the moment was shattered by Marcus. Brennan, whose fear had transformed into rage at being humiliated in front of the entire town. "Enough of this sentimental nonsense," he roared, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "You savages can't just ride into our town and steal our legally purchased property. We've got rights, and we've got the law on our side." He gestured wildly toward Sheriff Wade, demanding support that the lawman was increasingly reluctant to provide. Ayana's response was swift and decisive. In one fluid motion, he retrieved his knife from where it had embedded in the wooden post, the blade singing through the air before settling into his hand with practiced ease. "Rights," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You speak of rights while denying them to others. You invoke the law while breaking the laws of human decency. You claim civilization while practicing barbarism." The knife moved in his hand like a living thing, its edge catching the sunlight and throwing it back in deadly promises. The confrontation had reached its breaking point, and everyone present could feel the electricity in the air that preceded violence. Ayana's warriors had shifted almost imperceptibly, their hands moving closer to weapons, their bodies coiling with the fluid readiness of predators preparing to strike. The townspeople pressed back even further, creating a widening circle around the platform where Lucia and Miguel waited to learn their fate. Then, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk, came the sound that would end the standoff forever. The distant blast of a cavalry bugle echoing across the desert, followed by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A dust cloud rose on the horizon, growing larger by the second as blue-uniformed soldiers raced toward Silver Creek with the desperate urgency of men who knew they were already too late to prevent whatever catastrophe was unfolding. Sheriff Wade's face lit up with relief so profound it was almost religious in its intensity. "The cavalry," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Lieutenant Morrison and his patrol, they'll sort this mess out proper." His hand moved toward his gun again, emboldened by the approaching reinforcements, but Ayana's cold smile stopped him dead in his tracks. "Your soldiers are welcome," Ayana said with the calm confidence of a man who had faced cavalry charges before and lived to tell about it. "Perhaps they will provide more sport than these sheep." His warriors melted back toward their horses with fluid grace, but they didn't mount up instead. They spread out in defensive positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire when the inevitable shooting started. The cavalry patrol burst into the town square like a thunderbolt. 30 mounted soldiers in dust-covered blue uniforms led by a young lieutenant whose face showed the strain of hard riding. Lieutenant James Morrison, Frank Morrison's eldest son, returned from West Point with military precision, and his father's casual cruelty reined in his horse so hard the animal reared and pawed the air. His eyes took in the scene with practiced military assessment. Apache warriors in battle formation, townspeople pressed back in terror, and 2 Mexican children standing on an auction platform in the center of it all. "What in hell's name is going on here?" Morrison demanded, his voice carrying the crisp authority of military training and privileged birth. His gaze fixed on Ayana with the kind of professional interest that one predator shows another. Sheriff Wade explained the situation immediately. The order cracked like a whip, but Ayana merely smiled at the young officer's attempt to take command. Wade stumbled forward, his relief at being rescued warring with embarrassment at needing rescue in the first place. "Lieutenant Morrison, thank God you're here. This Apache chief Ayana Nalnish, he's disrupting a legal auction, threatening citizens, attempting to steal legally purchased property." The words tumbled out in a rush, each accusation piling on top of the last like stones building a wall of justification. Morrison's face darkened as he processed the sheriff's words. his hand dropping instinctively to his saber hilt. "Ayana Nalnish," he repeated, his voice heavy with recognition and barely controlled hatred. The ghost of the Chiricahuas. The butcher who wiped out the Henderson patrol last spring. His eyes locked onto Ayana's with the intensity of a man staring at his worst nightmare-made flesh. The same patrol that was burning Apache food stores and poisoning water sources. Ayana replied calmly, his voice carrying no defensiveness or apology. The same soldiers who shot children for sport and raped women for entertainment. Their deaths were justice, not butchery. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled cavalry Morrisons. Face went white with fury, his entire body trembling with the effort of maintaining military discipline when every instinct screamed for immediate violence. "You murdering savage!" Those were good men, soldiers serving their country with honor. His voice rose to a shout that echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder in a canyon. "Good men." Ayana mused, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. "Is that what you call men who torture prisoners? Is honor what you call the systematic slaughter of the innocent? Perhaps your definition of these words differs from mine." His casual tone made the accusation even more devastating, stripping away the romantic mythology that surrounded military service on the frontier. The young lieutenant's training warred with his emotions as he struggled to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "You will surrender yourself and your warriors immediately, or I will be forced to use deadly force to restore order to this town." The ultimatum carried all the weight of federal authority, backed by 30 Spencer rifles and the full might of the United States Army. Ayana's laugh was like wind through ancient canyons, rich with the knowledge of countless such confrontations that had ended in blood and sorrow. 30 soldiers against 20 Apache warriors, he said thoughtfully, as if calculating the odds of some distant sporting event. "Your men are tired from hard riding, unfamiliar with the terrain, and facing fighters who have been at war since before they could walk. But please, young lieutenant, by all means make your attempt." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Lieutenant Morrison's face cycled through a dozen different emotions as the reality of his situation became clear. He had been trained to fight conventional battles against conventional enemies, not to face legendary war chiefs in the middle of civilian populations. Every tactical advantage belonged to Ayana's forces, and they both knew it. Dr. Webb, who had remained silent during the military posturing, stepped forward with the desperate courage of a man trying to prevent a massacre. "Lieutenant, surely the situation doesn't require bloodshed. Perhaps we can negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution." But his words were cut off by Morrison's sharp gesture, the young officer's military pride warring with his survival instincts. "There will be no negotiation with hostiles," Morrison declared, his voice carrying the rigid certainty of someone who had been taught that compromise was weakness. "Federal law is clear on this matter. No civilian authority may be superseded by hostile native forces, regardless of circumstances." The legal language rolled off his tongue like a prayer, as if quoting regulations could somehow change the reality of his tactical disadvantage. Lucia had watched this exchange with growing terror, clutching Miguel so tightly that the baby began to fuss and squirm in her arms. She understood enough to know that violence was moments away, that the thin veneer of civilization was about to be stripped away to reveal the savage reality beneath. Her parents were dead, her home was gone, and now she was trapped between two forces that seemed bent on destroying each other, regardless of who might be caught in the crossfire. But then Ayana did something unexpected. Instead of responding to Morrison's ultimatum with threats or challenges, he turned away from the soldiers entirely and addressed Lucia directly, his voice gentle as a summer breeze, despite the tension crackling around them like electricity before a storm. "Little sister," he said, using words that somehow made her feel less alone in a world that had become completely insane. "Would you and your brother prefer to remain here as slaves, Or would you come with us to live as free people among the Apache? The question was simple, direct, cutting through all the legal and military complications to focus on what really mattered. The choice he offered was unlike anything she had ever imagined possible. In her short life, Lucia had known only the narrow options that poverty and prejudice allowed: servitude, suffering, or death. The idea that she might have some say in her own fate, that her preferences might actually matter to someone, was so foreign that it took her several heartbeats to understand what he was asking. You would take us with you?" She whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to pick up, stirring dust devils in the square. "Even though we are not Apache, even though we have nothing to offer you?" The questions revealed the depth of her desperation and the lifetime of rejection that had taught her to expect nothing from anyone. Anna's smile transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth and humanity that seemed impossible given the violence that surrounded him like an aura. "Child, the Apache have always been a people who judge by character rather than blood. You have protected your brother at the cost of your own freedom. That kind of courage and loyalty is honored among all true warriors." His words carried the weight of absolute sincerity, as if he were stating a fundamental truth about the nature of the universe. Lieutenant Morrison, seeing his authority being completely ignored, finally snapped under the strain of command and circumstance. "Enough of this nonsense," he roared, drawing his saber with a metallic rasp that cut through the air like a death knell. "I am ordering you to surrender those prisoners immediately, or I will consider you in active rebellion against federal authority." The blade gleamed in the afternoon sun, its edge sharp enough to split sunbeams. "And I am telling you," Ayana replied with deadly calm, his own weapons remaining sheathed, but his posture shifting subtly into a combat stance, "that these children are under my protection, and any who would harm them must go through me first." The two men faced each other across a distance of perhaps 20 feet, but it might as well have been an ocean for all the possibility of peaceful resolution that remained. The confrontation had reached its breaking point when salvation arrived. From an unexpected quarter, Dr. Webb, who had been silent during the military posturing, suddenly stepped forward and threw his medical bag at Lieutenant Morrison's feet with enough force to scatter its contents across the dusty ground. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had finally found his moral center. "I formally withdraw my bid for the girl. I renounce any claim to purchase her as indentured servant or slave." The declaration rang across the square like a bell tolling the end of an era. The doctor's action sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, breaking the spell of inevitability that had gripped them all. Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife who had bid on Miguel, suddenly looked around at the weapons and war paint and realized how close she had come to dying for the sake of purchasing a baby. Her face went pale as milk, and she began backing away from the platform with quick, nervous steps. "I also withdraw my bid," she stammered, her voice high and thin with barely controlled panic. "The baby can go wherever ... I mean, I don't want any trouble with..." Her words trailed off as she realized there was no way to explain her change of heart that wouldn't reveal the moral bankruptcy of her original position. Sheriff Wade watched his authority crumble like a sandcastle before the tide as more bidders began withdrawing their offers, unwilling to risk their lives for human property that suddenly seemed more trouble than it was worth. "Now wait just a minute," he protested weakly, but his voice carried none of its earlier conviction. "You can't just change your minds. There are legal obligations, binding contracts." But even he could see that the auction had become something far beyond his ability to control. Marcus Brennan, the mine owner who had started this chain of events with his crude comments, found himself isolated as the crowd pressed away from him like he carried some contagious disease. His earlier bravado had evaporated in the face of Apache steel, leaving only a sweating, terrified man who suddenly understood how close he had come to being gutted like a fish in front of half the town. Lieutenant Morrison looked around at The disintegrating situation with the confused expression of someone whose military training had never prepared him for this kind of social and moral complexity. His 30 soldiers sat their horses nervously, hands on weapons, but uncertain what constituted a legitimate target in this strange confrontation between law and justice. "This is highly irregular," Morrison declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "Federal law requires that legal proceedings be completed once initiated. You can't simply cancel an auction because of threats from hostile forces." But even as he spoke, he could see that the auction had already collapsed under the weight of its own moral contradictions. Ayanna watched this dissolution with the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice prevail against overwhelming odds. "It seems your civilized auction has civilized itself out of existence, young soldier," he observed with dry humor. "Perhaps your people are more capable of growth than I gave them credit for." The comment carried just enough mockery to sting, but also a note of genuine approval for those who had found the courage to do what was right. But the Apache chief was not finished with his demonstration of the power of moral authority over legal technicalities. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a handful of silver coin Spanish reales that glinted in the afternoon sun like captured starlight. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying across the square with commanding authority. "What was the total amount bid for these children before your auction collapsed?" The question was delivered with the casual tone of someone conducting routine business, rather than revolutionizing the social order. Wade, confused and flustered by this unexpected turn of events, fumbled for his papers with shaking hands. The girl reached $175, and the baby was at 40 before. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have sealed 2 innocents into slavery. $215 total. Ayanna calculated aloud, as if the mathematics of human bondage were simply another problem to be solved. He counted out coins from his pouch with deliberate precision, each piece ringing against the next with the clear note of silver against silver. "Here is $300 in Spanish silver, more than enough to pay whatever debts these children supposedly owe to your society." He held the coins out toward the sheriff, but his eyes remained fixed on Lieutenant Morrison throughout the exchange. The offer sent another shockwave through the crowd, fundamentally altering the nature of the confrontation from a military standoff to a commercial transaction. Sheriff Wade stared at the silver as if it were a poisonous snake, understanding that accepting it would legitimize everything that had happened. While refusing, it would admit that money had never been the real issue. "You're offering to buy their freedom?" Wade asked incredulously, his voice cracking under the strain of trying to process this latest development. "But that's not how the law works. You can't just pay off criminal debts and expect." But his protest died in his throat as he realized how hollow it sounded even to his own ears. "Can I not?" Ayanna asked with genuine curiosity, as if discussing some fascinating legal principle rather than the fate of 2 human beings. "Is payment of debts not a recognized practice in your legal system? Or does your law only function when the victims are powerless to resist?" The questions cut through Wade's protests like arrows through paper, exposing the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of the entire system. Dr. Webb, who had found his moral courage and seemed determined to use it, stepped forward again with renewed conviction. "The chief is absolutely right, Sheriff. If these children's debts can be satisfied with money, then money should satisfy them regardless of who pays. That's how commerce works in a free society." His medical training had taught him to diagnose problems accurately, and he was applying that skill to the moral sickness that had infected his community. Lieutenant Morrison, seeing the situation spiral completely beyond his control, made one last desperate attempt to reassert military authority over civilian chaos. "This entire proceeding is illegal," he declared, his voice rising to a shout that carried across the square like a challenge to the very gods themselves. Federal regulations clearly state that interactions with hostile forces must be conducted through proper military channels, not through unauthorized civilian negotiations. The words poured out in a torrent of bureaucratic desperation, but Ayanna had grown tired of the young officer's posturing and decided to end this charade once and for all. He walked slowly toward Morrison's horse, moving with the casual confidence of a man who had faced down cavalry charges and lived to tell about it. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through blood and courage rather than rank and privilege. "Tell me, Lieutenant," he said, his tone conversational despite the deadly serious nature of his words, "how many Apache children have you seen sold at auction? How many of my people's babies have been torn from their mother's arms and given to white families to be raised as slaves?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, forcing Morrison to confront the double standard that governed relations between white and native peoples. The young officer's face went through a series of complex emotions as the implications of Ayanna's question sank in. His military training had taught him to see Apache raids as unprovoked acts of savagery, but he had never been forced to consider what might provoke such desperation in the first place. That's different," Morrison stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Those are military actions, wartime casualties. This is a civilian legal proceeding." But even as he spoke, he could hear how weak his argument sounded, how hollow his justifications had become when subjected to the harsh light of moral scrutiny. Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade, cutting through Morrison's protests with surgical precision. "Different," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose it is different. When white soldiers steal Apache children, it is called civilization. When Apaches protect Mexican children from slavery, it is called hostility." The comparison was devastating in its simple clarity, stripping away layers of rationalization to reveal the ugly truth beneath. The confrontation had reached a moment of perfect balance, where all the forces that shaped life on the frontier military, might, legal authority, moral conviction, and simple human decency, hung suspended like dust motes in a shaft of sunlight. Everyone present understood that what happened next would determine not just the fate of Lucia and Miguel, but the very nature of justice in this harsh and unforgiving land. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, each second pregnant with the possibility of violence that could erupt at any moment. Then Lieutenant Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. He slowly, deliberately, returned his saber to its sheath with a metallic whisper that sounded like defeat itself. "Stand down," he ordered his men, his voice hoarse with the bitter taste of pragmatic wisdom overriding military pride. "There will be no engagement today." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through both cavalry and townspeople alike. His soldiers exchanged confused glances, hands still resting on weapons, but no longer certain what constituted friend or foe in this moral wasteland. Sheriff Wade gaped at the young officer as if he had suddenly sprouted wings and begun speaking in tongues. "Lieutenant, you can't be serious. These are federal fugitives, armed hostiles in violation of territorial law." His voice cracked with desperation as he watched his last hope of maintaining authority slip away like sand through his fingers. Morrison's face was a mask of professional composure, barely containing a storm of conflicted emotions. "Sheriff, I came here expecting to find Apache raiders threatening civilians. Instead, I find a situation so morally complex that military intervention would likely result in the deaths of innocents." He paused, his gaze moving from Ayanna to Lucia and Miguel, then back to the chief. "I will not be responsible for starting a war over the enslavement of children." Ayanna nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than a dozen treaties signed by politicians who had never seen the frontier. "You show wisdom, young soldier. Perhaps there is hope for your generation after all." The Apache chief's words carried genuine respect rather than mockery, recognition of courage displayed in choosing the difficult path over the convenient one. with the immediate threat of violence diffused, Ayanna turned his attention back to Lucia, who stood frozen on the platform like a statue carved from hope and terror. "Little sister," he said gently, extending his hand toward her, "the choice is still yours. Will you come with us, or do you prefer to remain here and trust in the mercy of those who would have sold your brother for 40 pieces of silver?" The reference to biblical betrayal was not lost on the Christian townspeople, many of whom shifted uncomfortably at the comparison. Lucia looked down at Miguel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, despite the chaos surrounding them, his tiny face peaceful in the way that only children can manage when shielded by love from the world's cruelties. She thought of their parents, dead and buried in unmarked graves, because they had been deemed unworthy of Christian burial. She thought of the 3 weeks she had spent hiding in abandoned buildings, stealing scraps of food while Miguel grew thinner and weaker each day. "If I come with you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind, "what will happen to us? What kind of life can we have among your people?" The questions revealed both hope and terror in equal measure. The desperate need to believe that somewhere in this harsh world, there existed a place where she and Miguel could be safe. Ayanna's expression softened with something that might have been paternal affection, as if he were speaking to his own daughter rather than a stranger. "You will be fed when you are hungry, protected when you are threatened, and loved as members of our family. Miguel will grow up free to run beneath the desert sun, to learn the ways of warriors and hunters, to become a man who bows to no one." His words painted a picture of possibility that seemed too beautiful to be real. "And what would be expected of me?" Lucia asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional weight of the moment. She had learned early that kindness often came with hidden costs, that generosity was frequently the prelude to exploitation. "You will be expected to care for your brother, to learn our ways, and to contribute to the welfare of the tribe according to your abilities," Ayanna replied with straightforward honesty. "You will be a daughter to our women, a sister to our warriors, and a teacher to our children, for you know the ways of the white world that we must understand if we are to survive." The role he described was one of dignity and purpose, far removed from the slavery that had awaited her in Silver Creek. Dr. Webb, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward one more time with the determination of a man who had finally found his moral center. "Chief Nalnish," he said formally, "I want to add my voice to yours in urging these children to go with you. I have seen what passes for mercy in this town, and I know it would be a slow death for both of them." His medical training had taught him to recognize symptoms of disease, and he could see the moral sickness that infected Silver Creek like a plague. The doctor's public endorsement of the Apache offer sent another shock wave through the assembled townspeople, many of whom were beginning to realize that their entire worldview was crumbling before their eyes. If the town's most respected physician was recommending that children flee to the Apache rather than trust in American justice, what did that say about the society they had built? Lucia looked around at the faces surrounding her, Sheriff Wade's frustrated authority, Lieutenant Morrison's conflicted duty, the townspeople's guilty discomfort, and finally Ayanna's steady strength. The choice was really no choice at all. "We will come with you," she said simply, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If you will have us, we will be Apache." The transformation that followed was swift and efficient, demonstrating the kind of tactical precision that had made Ayanna's warriors legendary throughout the Southwest. Within minutes, horses had been brought forward, supplies gathered, and preparations made for immediate departure. The Apache understood that their window of opportunity was narrow soon. Territorial governors and federal marshals would arrive with forces too, large to be deterred by moral arguments. One of Ayanna's warriors, a lean man with graying hair and scars that told stories of a lifetime spent in battle, approached Lucia with a gentle expression that seemed at odds with his fearsome appearance. "I am Nate," he said in accented but clear English. "I will Carry the little one until you learn to ride Apache style. He gestured toward a horse, equipped with a special cradle designed to hold infants safely during long desert journeys. Lucia hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming against trusting Miguel to a stranger, even one vouched for by Ayanna. But then she looked into Nature's eyes and saw something that reminded her of her own father, the steady strength of a man who understood that protecting children was the highest calling of any warrior. He likes to be sung to, she said softly, carefully transferring Miguel into Nature's experienced arms. Our mother used to sing him the song about the little bird who flew over the mountains. Her voice cracked slightly as she shared this intimate detail, this small piece of her family's love that she was entrusting to an Apache warrior. Nate nodded gravely, as if she had just shared military intelligence of the highest importance. I know that song, he said with a slight smile. My own grandmother sang it to me when I was young. Some melodies cross all boundaries. Little sister, they belong to the heart rather than to any one people. As the Apache band prepared to depart, Sheriff Wade made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his authority. Chief Nalnish, he called out, his voice carrying across the square like a plea for understanding. That silver you offered, it's still lying here in the dust. Don't you want to complete the transaction? Make this all legal and proper? The coins glinted in the afternoon sun like scattered stars, abandoned symbols of a system that had revealed its own moral bankruptcy. Ayanna glanced back at the silver, then at Wade, and finally at the assembled townspeople who had gathered to watch human beings sold like cattle. Keep your silver, Sheriff, he said with quiet dignity. Freedom cannot be purchased, it can only be claimed or given freely. These children were never property to be sold, and I will not legitimize your auction by participating in it. The rejection was devastating in its simple clarity, stripping away the last pretense that what had happened in Silver Creek had been anything other than slavery dressed up in legal language. Several townspeople began to drift away, unwilling to meet each other's eyes as they contemplated their participation in something they were beginning to understand was fundamentally evil. Lieutenant Morrison, still struggling with the implications of his decision to stand down, approached Ayanna with the stiff formality of military protocol, barely containing deeper emotions. Chief, he said carefully, I want you to understand that this situation cannot be repeated. My superiors will not be as flexible as I have chosen to be today. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Ayanna mounted his paint stallion with fluid grace, settling into the saddle as if he had been born there. Young soldier, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. If your people continue to sell children in the name of justice, there will be many more such situations. The choice of how to handle them lies with you and yours, not with me and mine. As the Apache band began to move, Lucia found herself mounted behind one of the warriors on a sturdy pony that stepped carefully to accommodate its inexperienced rider. The sensation of leaving Silver Creek behind felt like emerging from a dark cave into bright sunlight, painful at first, but ultimately liberating in ways she was only beginning to understand. Dr. Webb watched them go with an expression of profound sadness mixed with hope, understanding that he was witnessing something historically significant, the moment when two children chose freedom over security, dignity over survival, and found family among those whom his society had taught him to consider enemies. The last thing Lucia saw as they crested the ridge above Silver Creek was the auction platform standing empty in the town square, its wooden planks already being reclaimed by the desert wind that scattered dust across the abandoned coins. Behind them, a way of life that had never truly been alive was dying its inevitable death. Ahead of them lay the vast expanse of Apache territory, where different laws prevailed and children were valued for their potential rather than their price. As they rode deeper into the desert, Ayanna guided his horse alongside Lucia's mount. his presence both protective and reassuring. "Tell me about your parents," he said gently, understanding that grief shared is grief diminished. What manner of people were they, that they raised a daughter brave enough to steal horses for her brother's sake? The question invited her to honor their memory rather than simply mourn their loss. For the first time since her parents' death, Lucia found herself able to speak about them without the crushing weight of despair that had previously accompanied such memories. As she told Ayanna about her father's skill with horses and her mother's beautiful singing voice, she began to understand that love doesn't die with the beloved. It lives on in those who carry their memory forward into whatever future awaits. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of possibility, vast and challenging but no longer hostile. In the distance, smoke rose from Apache cooking fires, marking the location of a village where two Mexican orphans would soon learn what it meant to belong to a family that chose love over law, humanity over hatred, and the ancient bonds of kinship over the artificial divisions that men create to justify their cruelties. 3 months had passed since the day in Silver Creek, and the Apache village nestled in the hidden canyon felt more like home than any place Lucia had ever known. The rancheria consisted of 30 wickiups scattered among the cottonwoods beside a clear spring, their dome-shaped frames covered with brush and hides that blended seamlessly into the desert landscape. Children played between the dwellings while women tended cooking fires, and men worked on weapons and tools with the patient skill of those who understood that survival depended on perfection in small details. Lucia had learned to move through this world with quiet confidence, her initial terror replaced by something approaching contentment. She wore Apache clothing, now a deerskin dress decorated with blue and white beads that had been gifted to her by Ayanna's wife, Itzel, whose name meant rainbow and whose warmth had made the transition from Mexican orphan to Apache daughter possible. Miguel, now nearly a year old, had grown strong and healthy on a diet of wild game, pinyon nuts, and the attention of an entire village that treated him like a beloved grandson. But this morning was different. Lucia could sense tension in the air, a subtle shift in the rhythm of daily life that spoke of approaching change. Warriors cleaned their weapons with unusual care. Women spoke in hushed tones while they worked, and children played quietly rather than with their usual exuberant noise. Something was coming, and the Apache were preparing for it with the methodical thoroughness that had kept them alive in this harsh land for countless generations. The source of their concern became clear when Chato, the village's best scout, returned from a 3-day reconnaissance mission with news that sent ripples of alarm through the camp. "Soldiers," he reported to Ayanna and the other war leaders who had gathered around the council fire. 3 companies of cavalry, maybe 200 men, moving north from Fort Bowie. They're following our trail from Silver Creek. Lucia's blood turned to ice water in her veins as she absorbed the implications of Chato's report. 200 soldiers were coming because of her, because of the choice she had made to accept Apache protection rather than submit to slavery. The guilt hit her like a physical blow, crushing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Ayanna noticed her distress with the keen perception that had made him a legendary war leader. "Come with me, daughter," he said gently, using the Apache word that had gradually replaced his earlier little sister, as she proved herself worthy of full family membership. "We need to speak of what this news means for all of us." They walked together to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the canyon, a place where the village elders often came to think through difficult decisions. Below them, the Apache continued their preparations with calm efficiency, but Lucia could see the worry beneath their composed exteriors. These people had welcomed her as family, and now her presence was bringing death to their doorstep. "This is my fault," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "If I hadn't come with you, if I had just accepted my fate in Silver Creek, your people wouldn't be in danger now. Miguel and I should leave before." But Ayanna's raised hand stopped her words as effectively as a dam stops a river. "Do you "Think," he said quietly, his voice carrying the patient wisdom of a man who had faced countless such crises, "that the cavalry rides against us because we rescued 2 children? Do you believe that 200 soldiers march across the desert because a Mexican girl chose freedom over slavery?" His questions held no mockery, only the gentle insistence of a teacher helping a student understand a complex lesson. Lucia frowned, trying to follow his logic while her emotions screamed that she was responsible for bringing catastrophe down on these generous people. "But the soldiers are following our trail from Silver Creek. They're coming because of what happened at the Tadaselechi auction." Her voice carried the desperate certainty of someone who had already condemned herself. Ayana's smile was sad but understanding, the expression of a man who had learned to see beyond the surface of events to the deeper currents that drove history. "The soldiers march against us because we are Apache, daughter. They march because their government has decided that our people must be removed from this land so that white settlers can claim it without interference. They march because their president has ordered the final solution to what they call the Apache problem." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket, gradually replacing her personal guilt with a larger understanding of the forces at work. "You mean they would have come anyway, even if we had never met?" The possibility that her individual choices might not be the center of the universe was both humbling and oddly comforting. Within the year, Ayana confirmed with the certainty of someone who had studied his enemies for decades, perhaps sooner. "The mineral surveys have found silver in these mountains, and silver makes white men forget any promises they might have made to leave Apache lands in peace." He gestured toward the hidden canyon that sheltered their village, his expression reflecting both love for this place and understanding that their time here was ending. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, not the unshod ponies of Apache riders, but the heavy tread of cavalry mounts carrying full military equipment. Lucia's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized the sound, but Ayana remained calm, his hand resting lightly on his rifle as he studied the canyon entrance below. But instead of blue uniformed soldiers, 3 figures emerged from the desert heat shimmer. Dr. Webb from Silver Creek, riding between 2 Apache scouts who had obviously been escorting him through the treacherous mountain passes. The doctor looked exhausted from the journey, his black suit dusty and his medical bag strapped securely to his saddle, but his face carried the determined expression of a man on a mission of vital importance. Ayana stood slowly, his every movement careful and controlled as he processed this unexpected development. "It seems the medicine man has come calling," he observed, but his tone suggested wariness rather than welcome. "I wonder what news he brings that could not wait for a more convenient time." They made their way down to the village center, where Dr. Webb was already surrounded by curious Apache who maintained respectful distance while studying this unusual visitor. The doctor's presence here represented a violation of numerous territorial laws and military regulations. Civilians were forbidden from entering Apache territory without military escort, and any unauthorized contact with hostile tribes was considered tantamount to treason. "Chief Nalnish," Webb said formally, dismounting from his horse with the stiff movements of someone unaccustomed to long rides. "I've come to warn you about the cavalry column that's following your trail. But more importantly, I've come to ask for your help with something that affects far more than just military movements." Ayana studied the doctor with the patient intensity of a man who had learned that white visitors often brought trouble disguised as friendship. "Speak your words, medicine man. What brings you so far from your comfortable practice to seek help from those your people call savages?" The question carried an edge of suspicion, but also genuine curiosity about what could drive a respected white professional to risk everything for an illegal journey into Apache territory. Webb's face flushed with shame as he absorbed the implied criticism of his people's hypocrisy, but he pressed on with the determination of someone who had found a cause worth dying for. "There's been an outbreak of cholera in Silver Creek," he said bluntly. his medical training cutting through social niceties to focus on the essential facts. It started 2 weeks after you left, and it's already killed 17 people including 5 children. The territorial government has quarantined the town, but they won't send medical supplies or additional doctors because they're afraid of the disease spreading. The news hit the Apache village like a lightning strike, sending ripples of concern through the gathered crowd. Disease was one of the few enemies that even Apache warriors couldn't defeat with courage and skill. An invisible killer that had already devastated tribes throughout the Southwest. Many of these people had lost family members to smallpox, typhus, and other illnesses brought by white contact. Why do you tell us this? Ayanna asked, though Lucia could see that he already suspected the answer. Surely you did not risk your life to ride into Apache territory simply to share news of white man's sickness. Webb's response revealed the true depth of his transformation from passive participant in injustice to active agent of change. I need Apache healing knowledge, he said simply, his voice carrying the humility of a man who had finally learned that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. I've tried everything in my medical training, but the cholera is beyond my ability to treat effectively. I've heard that Apache medicine men have ways of dealing with such diseases, methods that European medicine doesn't understand, but that might save lives. The request hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, fundamentally altering the relationship between these two peoples who had been enemies for so long. Here was a white doctor, trained in the finest medical schools, acknowledging that primitive Apache healing might possess knowledge that civilized medicine lacked itself, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. With the quiet authority of someone whose opinion carried weight in council decisions. The cholera sickness, she said thoughtfully, her voice carrying the experience of someone who had seen many such outbreaks. It comes from bad water and bad air, but it can be fought with the right plants and ceremonies. Our healing ways are strong against such enemies. But her husband's expression remained troubled as he considered the implications of helping their former enemies. And what of the soldiers who follow our trail, medicine man? What of the cavalry that comes to destroy our village and scatter our people? Should we heal your sick while your warriors prepare to kill our children? The questions revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of frontier relations. How could one show mercy to those who showed none in return? Dr. Webb's face went pale as he realized the full complexity of what he was asking. But his medical oath compelled him to press forward regardless of political considerations. I can't speak for the cavalry chief. I'm just one man trying to save lives while there's still time. But I can tell you that the cholera doesn't care about skin color or politics, it kills. Apache and Mexican and white with equal enthusiasm, Lucia found herself stepping forward before she consciously decided to speak, driven by memories of her parents' fever and the helplessness she had felt watching them die. The sickness will spread, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent village. Disease doesn't respect boundaries between peoples. If it's killing whites in Silver Creek, it will eventually reach the Apache rancherias, the Mexican villages, everyone who shares this land. Her words carried the weight of hard-learned wisdom, the understanding that had come from watching loved ones succumb to illness while help remained forever out of reach. The assembled Apache nodded thoughtfully, recognizing truth when they heard it spoken with such painful personal knowledge. Ayanna looked around at his people, reading their faces with the skill of a leader who had learned to gauge collective sentiment through subtle signs invisible to outsiders. He saw concern, calculation, and beneath it all, the ancient Apache principle that courage sometimes meant helping one's enemies in order to protect one's own family. We will help, he said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a decision that would reshape the relationship between these peoples, whether they were ready for it or not. Not because we have forgotten the wrongs done to us, but because the spirits teach that healing is sacred work that transcends human conflicts. He paused, his gaze moving from Webb to Lucia to the faces of his own people. But know this, medicine. Man we help as equals, not as subjects begging for white man's approval. Our healing knowledge will be shared freely, but it will also be respected. The transformation that followed Dr. Webb's arrival defied every expectation that history and hatred had carved into the desert landscape. Within hours, the Apache village had reorganized itself around the urgent mission of combating an invisible enemy that threatened all life in the territory. Itzel emerged as the leader of this healing effort, her knowledge of traditional medicine combining with Webb's European training to create something entirely new, a fusion of ancient wisdom and modern technique that transcended the artificial boundaries. Men had drawn between civilized and savage. Lucia found herself at the center of this unprecedented collaboration, her ability to speak both Spanish and English making her an essential translator between worlds that had never before attempted meaningful communication. As she watched Apache healers demonstrate the preparation of plant medicines while Dr. Webb frantically scribbled notes in his medical journal, she began to understand that she was witnessing something historically significant, the birth of a new way of thinking about healing, cooperation, and human possibility. The urgency of their mission became clear when Shadow returned from another scouting expedition with news that made everyone's blood run cold. The sickness has reached Dos Santos, he reported, referring to a Mexican village 2 days' ride south of Silver Creek. 15 dead in 3 days, including the priest and 2 children. The survivors are fleeing north, bringing the disease with them. His words painted a picture of devastation spreading like wildfire across the territory. Itzel's response was immediate and decisive, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced such crises before and learned that swift action was the only defense against epidemic disaster. "We need gathering parties," she announced to the assembled healers and warriors. Oak bark from the high country, desert willow from the arroyos, and white sage from the sacred places. Dr. Webb says his people die from losing too much water. Our medicines can help their bodies hold what they need. But even as the Apache mobilized their healing knowledge, the approaching cavalry remained a constant threat that could not be ignored. The irony was bitter. They were racing to save lives while soldiers marched to destroy their village, trying to heal the same people whose government had declared them enemies deserving only death or captivity. The contradiction embodied everything wrong with the way civilized nations approached those they deemed inferior. Dr. Webb worked with desperate intensity, his medical training finally given purpose by the partnership with Apache healers who understood diseases he had only read about in textbooks. "This willow bark preparation," he said wonderingly as he watched Itzel demonstrate the proper brewing technique. "It's more effective than anything in my medical bag. How long have your people known about these treatments?" His voice carried the humility of a man discovering how much he had yet to learn. "Since the beginning," Itzel replied simply, her hands moving with practiced precision as she ground herbs into powder that would soon save lives in Silver Creek and beyond. "The plants speak to those who listen with proper respect. Your people are too busy talking to hear what the earth tries to teach." Her words carried no condemnation, only the patient sadness of someone watching others struggle with problems that had already been solved. The first test of their collaborative medicine came sooner than expected. Miguel, who had been playing happily with the other Apache children, suddenly developed a high fever that sent Lucia into a panic that transported her instantly back to the helpless terror she had felt watching her parents die. But this time, she was not alone in facing the crisis. Both Apache and European healing traditions mobilized around the tiny boy who had become a bridge between worlds. Dr. Webb examined Miguel with clinical precision while Itzel prepared traditional fever remedies, their different approaches complementing rather than conflicting as they worked to save a life that had already survived more than any child should have to endure. "His symptoms match the early stages of cholera," Webb announced grimly. his voice tight with the professional control that barely contained deeper emotions. But caught this early, with the right treatment, he left the sentence unfinished. Hope and fear warring in his expression, Lucia held Miguel close while the healers worked around them, his small body burning with fever that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. She whispered prayers in Spanish, English, and the Apache words she had learned during her months in the village, as if speaking to God in multiple languages might increase the chances of being heard. Around her, the entire community held its breath, understanding that this moment would determine whether their healing alliance was blessed or cursed. The breakthrough came at dawn on the third day, when Miguel's fever finally broke and he opened his eyes with something approaching his normal alertness. Dr. Webb checked his pulse with shaking hands while Itzel examined the color of his skin and the clarity of his breathing, both healers nodding with satisfaction as they confirmed what everyone hoped to see: the little boy would live, saved by medicines that bridged two healing traditions. But their celebration was cut short by the sound that had haunted Lucia's nightmares for months: the thunder of cavalry hooves approaching at full gallop. The soldiers had finally found them, and this time there would be no Lieutenant Morrison to choose discretion over military glory. Through the canyon entrance rode Colonel Marcus Whitman, a career officer whose reputation for brutality against Apache communities had earned him both promotion and the kind of fame that came from solving problems with overwhelming violence. By order of the territorial governor and the United States Army, Whitman's voice boomed across the village, amplified by the canyon walls, until it seemed to come from the very stones themselves. This illegal gathering is hereby disbanded. All Apache will report for immediate transport to the San Carlos Reservation. Any resistance will be met with deadly force. His words carried the absolute authority of someone who had never doubted his right to impose order through violence. Yana stepped forward with the calm dignity that had made him legendary among both allies and enemies, his presence somehow making the canyon seem smaller, while simultaneously emphasizing the vast gulf between military might and moral authority. "Colonel Whitman," he said formally, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone, "your timing is unfortunate. We are engaged in saving the lives of your own people, lives that your government has apparently decided are worth sacrificing for the sake of military convenience." The colonel's face darkened with fury at this unexpected challenge to his authority, his hand dropping instinctively to his saber hilt as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. Apache and white doctor working together, Mexican children living among hostiles, traditional enemies cooperating in ways that violated every assumption about racial hierarchy and civilizational superiority. Dr. Webb. Whitman's voice cracked like a whip as he identified the Silver Creek physician among the Apache healers. "You are in violation of federal law, consorting with enemy combatants during a time of military action. You will surrender yourself immediately for court-martial proceedings." The threat carried the weight of military justice, swift and merciless for those who chose the wrong side in conflicts between civilization and savagery. But Webb had found something in the canyon that was worth more than military approval or professional standing. He had found purpose that transcended personal safety. "Colonel," he replied with the steady voice of someone who had finally learned what he was willing to die for, "I am a doctor, sworn to preserve life wherever I find it threatened. These people have healing knowledge that could save hundreds of lives, including the lives of soldiers under your command. Would you rather I abandon that mission to satisfy military protocol?" The challenge was delivered with professional courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Whitman's response revealed the fundamental rigidity that made career military officers both effective and dangerous when faced with situations that didn't fit established patterns. "The law is clear, Doctor. Unauthorized contact with hostile forces constitutes treason, regardless of medical justification. You have 1 minute to surrender yourself and any American citizens under Apache influence." His ultimatum echoed through the canyon like a death sentence pronounced from on high. Lucia felt the world narrow to a single point of crystalline clarity as she realized that everything they had built over the past months, the healing alliance, the family bonds, the bridge between worlds, was about to be destroyed by the same mindless adherence to law over justice that had nearly enslaved her in Silver Creek. But this time, she was not helpless. This time, she had allies who valued courage over compliance. Colonel Whitman, she called out, stepping forward with Miguel in her arms, her voice carrying the clear tone of someone who had learned that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of collaboration with evil. I am Lucia Morales, and this is my brother Miguel. 3 months ago, your territorial law declared us criminals deserving of slavery. Today, we are helping to save lives that your government has abandoned. Which version of law do you choose to enforce? The one that enslaves children, or the one that heals the sick? Her questions cut through military protocol like arrows through paper. The confrontation had reached its climax when an unexpected voice joined the dialogue. Lieutenant Morrison, who rode into the canyon with a small patrol and an expression that suggested he had been wrestling with demons of conscience since their last meeting. Colonel Whitman, he said formally, saluting his superior officer while his eyes conveyed a message that transcended military hierarchy. I feel obligated to report that Dr. Webb's medical mission has already saved 17 lives in Silver Creek, using techniques developed through collaboration with Apache healers. Perhaps military objectives should be reassessed in light of humanitarian success. Whitman's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions as he processed this information. His military training warring with political pragmatism and basic human decency. The territory was watching. Newspapers would report whatever happened here, and voters had opinions about officers who prevented doctors from saving lives during epidemic crises. The stalemate might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the arrival of an entirely unexpected party. Sheriff Wade from Silver Creek, accompanied by a delegation of townspeople, including Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Ashford, and even Marcus Brennan, all of whom looked thoroughly humbled by their recent experience with epidemic disease. They rode into the canyon with the subdued demeanor of people who had been forced to confront the consequences of their own moral choices. Colonel Whitman, Sheriff Wade called out, his voice carrying none of its former bluster. I've come to request that you postpone any military action against this Apache village. Dr. Webb's work here has saved more lives in the past week than our territorial government has saved in the past year. The admission cost him visibly, stripping away layers of official dignity to reveal a man who had finally learned to distinguish between legal authority and moral legitimacy. Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife who had once bid to purchase Miguel as a household slave, dismounted from her horse with visible difficulty and approached Lucia with an expression of profound shame. Miss Morales, she said formally, her voice cracking with emotion, I've come to apologize for my actions at the auction. I've seen what real Christian charity looks like this past week, and it wasn't anything I recognized from my own behavior. The apology carried the weight of genuine transformation rather than mere social convention. The circle of reconciliation expanded as other townspeople stepped forward to acknowledge their complicity in injustice and their gratitude for healing that had transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Even Marcus Brennan, the mine owner whose crude comments had helped precipitate the original crisis, managed a grudging admission that Apache medicine had saved his own daughter's life when European treatments had failed. Colonel Whitman found himself facing a situation that no military manual had prepared him for: unanimous civilian pressure to protect the very people he had been ordered to destroy. His career depended on following orders, but his political future depended on public approval, and the public was clearly on the side of healing over destruction. The resolution came from an unexpected source, Ayana himself, who stepped forward. with a proposal that demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made him legendary among both allies and enemies. "Colonel," he said formally, "perhaps there is a way to satisfy both military necessity and humanitarian need. My people are willing to establish a formal healing partnership with territorial authorities, a medical alliance that would benefit everyone while ensuring that Apache knowledge is properly respected and protected." The proposal was revolutionary in its implications, suggesting a relationship between native and settler populations based on mutual benefit rather than domination and submission. It offered the colonel a way to transform a potential military disaster into a diplomatic triumph, while giving the Apache a form of protection that treaties had never provided. Dr. Webb seized the moment with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his life's calling in the most unexpected place. Such an alliance would revolutionize frontier medicine. He added eagerly, his professional excitement overriding political caution. "The techniques we've developed here could save thousands of lives across the Southwest. Surely that's worth more than any military victory." The negotiation that followed established precedents that would reshape relations between native peoples and territorial governments throughout the American West. For the first time, an Apache community was recognized not as hostile savages to be exterminated or subdued, but as equal partners in a relationship that benefited everyone involved. Lucia watched these historic developments with Miguel sleeping peacefully in her arms, finally understanding that the choice she had made in Silver Creek had led to something far greater than personal salvation. She had helped create a bridge between worlds that had been enemies for so long that peace seemed impossible, proving that individual acts of courage could sometimes change the course of history itself. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the American Southwest from a region of perpetual conflict to one of unprecedented cooperation between diverse peoples, they would trace its origins to a single moment in Silver Creek when a young woman chose freedom over slavery and an Apache chief chose justice over law. But for Lucia, the real miracle was simpler and more personal. Miguel grew up strong and healthy in a world where his identity as both Mexican and Apache was celebrated rather than hidden, where healing knowledge flowed freely between peoples who had learned that wisdom belonged to no single culture. The canyon that had once hidden refugees from justice became a center of learning where doctors from across the territory came to study techniques that combined the best of all healing traditions. Children who might have grown up as enemies instead played together in the shadow of the mountains, speaking multiple languages and carrying multiple cultural inheritances that made them richer rather than confused. And sometimes, when the desert wind carried the sound of laughter across the healing gardens that now flourished where weapons had once been stored, Lucia would remember the auction platform in Silver Creek and understand that the choice to resist injustice, no matter how impossible the odds might seem, was always the right choice, because it opened doorways to futures that fear could never imagine.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.